Louisa, Please Come Home by Shirley Jackson. Page 64. I listened to my mother's trembling voice over the radio. "Louisa," she said, "please come home. It's been 3 years since we saw you. We all miss you, and we want you to come back again. Louisa, please come home." Once a year, I heard that announcement on the anniversary of the day I ran away. I also read the newspaper stories about myself. Louisa Tether disappeared 1 year ago, or 2 years, or 3. I used to wait for June 20th as if it were my birthday. I was residing in Chandler. It was a big enough city for me to hide in. It was also near my old home, so the papers always made a big fuss about the anniversary of my disappearance. I didn't decide to leave home on the spur of the moment. I had been planning it for a long time. Page 65. I knew that everything had to go just right, because if I made any errors, I would have looked like a ridiculous fool. My sister Carol would never have let me forget that. I admit I planned my departure for the day before Carol's wedding. The newspapers reported that my family had the wedding anyway. Carol told a reporter that her sister Louisa would have wanted it that way. She would never have wanted to spoil my wedding, Carol explained, but secretly she knew that was exactly what I'd wanted. Anyway, on that day, everyone was hurrying around the house, making preparations for the wedding. I just walked out the door and started my new life. Page 66. There was only one bad minute when Paul saw me. Paul lived next door to us, and Carol hates him more than she hates me. My mother can't stand him either. Of course, Paul didn't know I was running away. I told him the exact same story I had told my parents. I was going downtown to get away from all the confusion and excitement. Paul wanted to come with me, but I ran for the bus and left him standing there. I rode the bus downtown and then walked to the railroad station. I purchased a round-trip ticket to Crane to make them think I was planning to return. That way, they wouldn't start looking for me too quickly. I knew they'd think I would stay in Crane. It was the biggest city the train went to, but my plan was to stay there for only part of 1 day. To change my appearance, I bought a tan raincoat in a department store in Crane. I had left home wearing a conspicuous new jacket. I just left the jacket on a counter in the store. Someone probably bought it. I was pretty confident about one thing. There must be thousands of 19-year-old girls, fair-haired, 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighing 126 pounds, and a lot of them would be wearing shapeless tan raincoats. I wouldn't be unique, and nobody would detect me. It's funny how no one pays any attention to you. Hundreds of people saw me that day, but no one really saw me. I took a train to Chandler, which is the place where I'd been heading all along. I slept on the train. When I got there, I bought a suitcase, stockings, and a little clock. I put the other items in the suitcase. Then I was ready to get settled in Chandler. Nothing is hard to do unless you get upset or excited about it. Page 67. I decided what my new identity would be. I was a 19-year-old girl named Lois Taylor who had a nice family upstate. I had saved enough money to come live in Chandler. When the summer ended, I would go to business school. I would need a job to pay for it. I stopped in a drugstore for breakfast and a paper. I read the ads for furnished rooms. Everything about me appeared so normal. Suitcase, raincoat, rooms for rent. When I asked the clerk at the drugstore how to get to Primrose Street, he never even glanced at me. I walked into Mrs. Peacock's house in Primrose Street, and right away I knew this was the perfect place. My room was nice, and Mrs. Peacock and I genuinely liked each other. She was pleased that my mother wanted me to find a clean room in a good neighborhood, and she was even more pleased that I wanted to save money so I could send some home every week. Page 68. Within an hour, Mrs. Peacock knew all the details about my imaginary family. I told her that my mother was a widow, my sister had just been married, and my younger brother Paul made my mother worry a lot because he didn't want to settle down. Mrs. Peacock was eager to take care of me. She told me about a job in a stationery store. So there I was. I had been away from home for 24 hours, and already I was a whole new person. I was Lois Taylor. I lived on Primrose Street and worked at the stationery store. In the mornings, Mrs. Peacock and I would read the newspapers during breakfast. She'd ask my opinion about the girl who disappeared over in Rockville. I'd say she must be insane to leave a nice home like that. Once I picked up the newspaper and looked intently at the picture. "Do you think she looks like me?" I asked Mrs. Peacock. "No," Mrs. Peacock responded. "Her hair is longer, and her face is fatter than yours." "I think she kind of resembles me," I said. My picture appeared in the Chandler papers a lot, but no one ever looked at me twice. I went to work, I shopped in the stores, and I went to the movies and the beach with Mrs. Peacock. Still, no one recognized me. I had done a perfect job of changing my identity. One morning, Mrs. Peacock was reading about my disappearance. "They're saying now that she was kidnapped," she said. "I feel kind of sorry for her," I said. "You can never tell," she said. "Maybe she went willingly with the kidnapper." Page 69. On the anniversary of my running away, I bought a new hat. When I got home, Mrs. Peacock was listening to the radio. I heard my mother's familiar voice. "Louisa," she said, "please come home." "That poor woman," Mrs. Peacock said. "Imagine how she must feel. She hasn't given up hope of finding her little girl alive someday." I decided not to go to business school after all, since the stationery store was expanding, and I would probably be a manager soon. Mrs. Peacock and I agreed it would be foolish to give up such a secure job. By this time, I had some savings in the bank. I was adjusting to my new life. I never had a thought about returning home. It was just plain bad luck that I had an encounter with Paul. Page 70. I didn't stop to think when I recognized him on the street. I automatically yelled, "Paul!" He turned around and stared at me with a shocked expression on his face. Then he said, "Is it possible?" He said I had to go back. If I didn't, he threatened to tell my parents where I was. He told me there was still a reward for anyone who found me and assured me that I could run away again after he got the reward. Maybe I really wanted to go home. Maybe that's why I yelled his name out on the street. Anyway, I decided to go with him. I told Mrs. Peacock that I was leaving to visit my family upstate. I thought that was funny. Paul sent a telegram to my mother and father. Page 71. When we arrived in Rockville, we took a taxi to my house. I began to get nervous as I looked out the window. I would have sworn that I hadn't thought about Rockville for 3 years, but I remembered it all precisely, as if I had never been away. The taxi turned onto my street. When I saw the house, I almost cried. "Everything just looks the same," I said. "I caught the bus right there on the corner." "If I had managed to stop you that day," Paul said, "you would probably never have tried again." As we walked up the driveway, I wondered if my family was watching from the window and if I'd have to ring the doorbell. I'd never had to ring it before. I was still wondering when Carol opened the door. "Carol," I said. I was genuinely glad to see her. Carol looked at me hard. Then she stepped back, and I saw my mother and father. I was going to run to them, but I held myself back. I wasn't sure if they were angry with me, or hurt, or happy that I was back. I wasn't sure of what to say, so I just stood there and said, "Mother?" kind of uncertainly. She put her hands on my shoulders and then looked at my face for a long time. There were tears running down her cheeks, and she looked old and sad. Then she turned to Paul and said, "Oh, Paul, how could you do this to me again?" Paul looked frightened. "Mrs. Tether." My mother asked me, "What is your name, dear?" Louisa Tether, I said stupidly. No, dear, she said very gently. Your real name. Now I felt like crying. Louisa Tether, I said. That's my name. Page 72. Why don't you people leave us alone? Carol screamed. We've spent years trying to find my sister, and people like you just try to cheat us out of reward money, and we get hurt and heartbroken all over again. Carol, my father said, you're frightening the poor child. Young lady, he said to me, I don't think you've realized the cruelty of what you are doing. You look like a nice girl. Try to imagine your own mother, how your own mother would feel if someone did this to her. I tried to imagine my own mother. I looked straight at her. My father said, I'm sure this young man didn't tell you he's taken advantage of us before. He tried to deceive us twice when he's brought us girls who pretended to be our Louisa. The first time we were fooled for several days. The girl looked like our Louisa, and she acted like our Louisa. She even knew about personal family things that only Louisa or Paul could know. But she was not our daughter. She was an impostor, and my wife suffers more each time her hopes are raised. He put one arm around my mother and the other around Carol. They all stood there staring at me. Paul started to argue with them. I suddenly realized that all I wanted was to stay here, but it was evident that I couldn't. They had made up their minds that I wasn't Louisa. Paul, I said, can't you see that you're only making Mr. Tether angry? Correct, young lady, my father said. Paul, I said, these people don't want us here. Page 73. Paul was about to argue again, but instead he turned and stomped off toward the door. I turned to follow him. My father, Mr. Tether, came up behind me and took my hand. My daughter was younger than you, he said in a gentle tone, but I'm certain you have a family somewhere. Go back to the people who love you. That meant Mrs. Peacock, I guess. To make sure you get there, my father said, I want you to take this. He put a folded bill in my hand. I hope someone will do as much for our Louisa. Goodbye, my dear, my mother said, and reached up and patted my cheek. Good luck to you. I hope your daughter comes back someday, I told them. Goodbye. The bill was a 20, and I gave it to Paul. He'd gone to a lot of trouble, and I still had my job at the stationery store. My mother still talks to me on the radio once a year on the anniversary of the day I ran away. Louisa, she says, please come home. We all want our dear girl back, and we need you and miss you so much. Your mother and father love you and will never forget you. Louisa, please come home.